I don't fucking care about all you broke people living life as a coward.
I have learned over many years on this bench that mockery is rarely accidental. It is a language men use when they believe consequences are imaginary, when they believe authority belongs to them by default and not by structure. What occurred in this courtroom today was not an outburst, it was a test. You chose to treat this proceeding as theater. You smiled when you should have listened. You laughed when the court addressed you directly. You interrupted not out of confusion but out of confidence, the confidence of a man who believed the room would bend around him as it always had. I allowed it to continue longer than I normally would, not out of patience but out of clarity. Courts reveal character best when they do not rush to silence it. And what you revealed was not defiance alone, it was contempt, not just for this court, but for the idea that authority could exist above your own. When I instructed you to stop, you did not. When I warned you, you escalated. And when I reminded you where you were, you chose mockery over restraint. That choice matters, not because it offended me, but because it exposed you. Authority is not proven by volume or bravado, it is proven by compliance with limits. The moment you treated those limits as optional, you forfeited the privilege of remaining in this room. You seemed to believe the court required your cooperation to function, that my authority depended on your acknowledgement. That misunderstanding is not uncommon among men who have rarely been corrected, but it is fatal to order. I do not raise my voice to compete with disrespect. I do not argue with disruption. I respond to it with structure, and structure does not negotiate. You were not removed because you spoke. You were removed because you refused to listen. You were not escorted out for disagreement, but for contempt, not symbolic contempt, but operational contempt that threatens the integrity of proceedings. The law tolerates many things. It does not tolerate being mocked by those it is actively judging. This courtroom is not a stage for performance. It is a place where authority is exercised quietly, decisively, and without apology. You misjudged that, and within minutes, the consequences arrived. Not dramatically, not emotionally, precisely. There is a misconception that authority is fragile, that it must be defended loudly or reinforced constantly. In truth, authority only becomes fragile when it hesitates. What you mistook for restraint was not uncertainty, it was deliberation. You assumed the court would accommodate your behavior, that it would adapt to your tone, your interruptions, your refusal to observe basic decorum. That assumption did not come from nowhere. It came from a history of rooms where your presence shifted gravity, where rules softened in anticipation of your reaction. This is not one of those rooms. The moment you chose mockery, you made a calculation. You calculated that the court would prioritize progress over principle, efficiency over order. You believed disruption would be tolerated because addressing it would slow things down. You believed correctly in other places. Here, progress without order is meaningless. When you laughed, it was not the sound itself that mattered. It was what it communicated, that you believed the process was beneath you, that the court was an inconvenience, not an authority, that consequences were theoretical, distant, negotiable. They are none of those things. I want the record to be clear on this point. Removal from a courtroom is not punishment, it is preservation, preservation of order, preservation of fairness, preservation of the right of this court to function without becoming a spectacle for those who mistake attention for leverage. You were given instruction, you ignored it. You were given warning, you dismissed it. Each step was deliberate. Each opportunity to correct course was declined. By the time security approached you, the decision had already been made, not in emotion, but in logic. Authority does not argue with disruption because argument implies equivalence. There is none. The court does not persuade contempt to behave, it removes it. Some will say 3 minutes was too fast, that more patience should have been shown. That removal escalated the situation. Those arguments misunderstand how order works. Delay rewards disruption. Hesitation invites repetition. You were not removed to make an example. You were removed because you made yourself incompatible with proceedings. That incompatibility was entirely within your control. It is important to understand this distinction. You were not silenced. You were disqualified temporarily and lawfully from participating because participation requires compliance. Rights exist within structure. When structure is rejected, access is suspended. This court does not compete for dominance. It enforces boundaries, quietly, consistently, without apology. You tested those boundaries, you found them firm. What concerns this court most is not the disruption itself, but the mindset that produced it. Mockery in a courtroom does not appear spontaneously. It is learned. It is reinforced in places where authority is tolerated only when convenient and dismissed when it becomes inconvenient. You did not behave as though you misunderstood the rules. You behaved as though you believed the rules would eventually bend. That belief is not confidence, it is entitlement. Entitlement is revealed when a man assumes consequences are negotiable, when he believes charm, volume, or persistence will exhaust the system into compliance, when he treats authority as something to be worn down rather than respected. This court does not tire. Public perception often misunderstands restraint. When a judge remains calm in the face of provocation, some interpret it as weakness. They are mistaken. Calm is the absence of panic, not the absence of control. It is the clearest signal that authority is intact. You mistook silence for surrender. You mistook patience for permission. By the time you realized the difference, the moment had passed. Courtrooms are not democratic spaces in the way public forums are. They are hierarchical by necessity. That hierarchy exists not to elevate the judge, but to protect fairness. When one individual refuses to submit to that structure, fairness collapses for everyone else in the room. The law cannot operate on sarcasm. It cannot function amid derision. It cannot pause indefinitely to accommodate those who believe decorum is optional. When that line is crossed, response is not emotional, it is procedural. Your removal was not dramatic because it did not need to be. It was not punitive because it was not personal. It was administrative, efficient, final. This is what often shocks those who mock authority, how little effort it takes to enforce it once the decision is made. There is no shouting, no argument, no escalation, just action. You were escorted out because the court refused to allow one individual's contempt to contaminate the legitimacy of the process. That legitimacy matters more than any single participant's ego. The courtroom did not lose control when you were removed, it regained it. And that is the distinction you fail to understand. Authority in this courtroom does not exist to command respect for its own sake. It exists to protect those who have none. Every rule, every procedure, every boundary enforced here is designed to ensure that the quiet, the vulnerable, and the unheard are not overwhelmed by those who believe volume equals validity. When one person mocks the court, the damage does not stop at disrespect. It signals to everyone else that the rules are optional, that decorum is flexible, that power belongs to whoever is bold enough to seize it. That is not a risk this court will take. You may believe your behavior affected only yourself. That is incorrect. It threatened the integrity of the proceedings for every other individual present. Litigants waiting their turn, witnesses preparing to speak, families watching closely to see whether this system deserves their trust. This court does not remove people lightly. Removal is a last resort, used only when the alternative is disorder. You force that decision by refusing to participate within the structure provided. There is a difference between disagreement and disruption. Disagreement is expected. It is addressed through argument, evidence, and law. Disruption rejects all three. It substitutes noise for substance and mockery for engagement. The law has no response to mockery except enforcement. You were warned because fairness demands warning. You were given opportunity because justice demands opportunity. Once those were exhausted, enforcement was inevitable. Some will argue that strong authority intimidates, that it discourages participation. The opposite is true. Clear authority creates safety. It assures every person in this courtroom that the rules apply equally and that no one can hijack the process through intimidation or ridicule. When security approached you, the courtroom did not react with shock. It reacted with relief. Relief that order had been restored. Relief that the proceedings could continue without interference. Authority, when exercised correctly, does not dominate, it stabilizes. You tested whether this court would compromise its structure to accommodate your behavior. It did not, and it will not, for anyone. Consequences are often misunderstood as punishment imposed in anger. That misunderstanding allows people to dismiss them as personal or excessive. In truth, consequences are simply the visible edge of accountability. They arrive not because authority is offended, but because limits were crossed. You were removed from this courtroom not to humiliate you, but to clarify something you refused to acknowledge. Participation in the justice system is conditional on respect for its structure. No one is entitled to occupy this space while actively undermining it. 3 minutes was not a short time. It was sufficient. Sufficient to listen, sufficient to adjust, sufficient to recognize that the court was not engaging in a performance. You used those minutes to escalate instead. The court did not act quickly, it acted decisively. There is a difference. This decision was not reactive. It was inevitable the moment mockery replaced compliance. Authority that hesitates in moments like that teaches the wrong lesson, that disruption works, that persistence erodes boundaries, that disrespect is a viable strategy. This court teaches the opposite. Accountability does not negotiate, it does not debate tone, it does not match energy, it enforces limits and moves forward. That is what happened here. You may leave believing you were removed unfairly. You may tell others that authority overreached. That narrative is common among those who mistake tolerance for weakness. It does not concern this court. What concerns this court is that everyone who witnessed this understands the truth. Authority is not proven by how loudly one challenges it, but by how calmly it responds. The proceedings continued. Order was restored. Justice remained intact. That is the measure of success here. Mockery did not weaken this court. It clarified its boundaries, and that is why, 3 minutes after you chose to test authority, security escorted you out, quietly, efficiently, and without drama, because authority, when real, does not need to explain itself twice. Court is adjourned.